Yeah? Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much for having me here to speak today. I told the gentleman setting up the mic that I would introduce myself, but I think that most of you know me and I know most of you. I'm Kecia Ali. I've been a member of this center for about a quarter century, I think. I remember back in the old days when Ramadan speakers gave their talks before the iftar. No one could focus on anything. The speaker couldn't be heard over the grumbling of people's stomachs. Hopefully now everybody is a little bit full, a little bit satiated, and inshallah, a little bit better able to reason and appreciate, but that also means the stakes are a little bit higher for the speakers. So I hope that, inshallah, you will treat me kindly and forgive me any mistakes. I'm hoping today to offer a little bit of reflection at the end of our second day of fasting on the topic of al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahi an al-munkar. So we usually translate this as commanding right and forbidding wrong. And I chose this topic very selfishly because, like most of the people that I encounter in my day-to-day life these days, I feel very much at sea in the world in the moment. It feels like the world is on fire. And, if you look at LA, it literally is. Executive orders are coming fast and furious, right? Education, refugees, immigrants, foreign aid. Eggs cost $1 million, just for a dozen, and new viruses keep turning up. A long-delayed ceasefire is holding very tenuously, and humanitarian aid to Gaza has just cruelly been cut off. And I could go on, but the point is the moment feels and in fact is very precarious. We are, of course, not the first people and not the first Muslims to confront chaotic and difficult times. The Mongols sacked Baghdad. There was the Black Plague, right? There was transatlantic trade in enslaved human beings. There have been lots of catastrophes in lots of places over the course of human history. But we may be, roughly speaking, the first generation to confront some of these crises with the constant stream of news alerts about things that we feel, and in some very meaningful sense, are powerless to change. We get apps, we get notifications, we get texts from our mothers-in-law. It is all happening everywhere, all at once, in our phones and in our newspapers, if anybody still reads those, and on the television screens, right? We cannot escape the news that is impinging on us from all sides. So thinking about what it means to join good and reject evil, which is another translation, seems to me one place to think about how we navigate in the moment, how we find a foothold individually and collectively from which to engage everything that is happening right now. So in the 20-ish minutes allotted to me this evening, I'm going to do three things. I'm going to give a quick definition of commanding right and forbidding wrong, and touch briefly, very briefly, on the sacred sources that are the basis for our understanding of it. And second, mostly because, as you know, if you know me, I'm an Islamic law nerd, I'm going to talk about the kinds of things that the jurists argued about, because they were lawyers, of course they argued, when they talked about it and reflected on it. And last, I'm going to offer some thoughts about what useful guidance we might take from this tradition of thinking about this duty as we concentrate on our worship and our obligations to God in this month, but also in practice connect to our community more than we often do at other times of the year. So, what is commanding right and forbidding wrong? They sound like separate things, right? It's two verbs, but they get talked about together in the Quran on multiple occasions. We are told numerous times that commanding right and forbidding wrong are or is a characteristic of believers. For instance, in Surah At-Tawbah, we learn, and here I'm quoting, the believers, both men and women, are guardians of one another. Awliya, maybe they're also allies, right, or friends. They command what is right and forbid what is wrong, establish prayer, pay zakat, and obey Allah and Allah's messenger. It is they who will be shown Allah's mercy. Surely Allah is almighty, all-wise. Meanwhile, in Surah Al-Imran, we see the importance of this duty of commanding right and forbidding wrong, such that we're told that a group should be established to do this, right? Let there be a group among you who who call to goodness, command what is right, and forbid what is wrong. It is they who will be successful. There are other examples, I could quote more, but the crucial thing to know is that commanding, enjoining, encouraging people to do the right thing matters. As with the other duties that the Quran lays out, of course, we don't necessarily get all the details about what it is we're supposed to do. Now, in many places, when the Quran tells us to do a thing and doesn't provide a lot of details, we turn to the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And here, we do get a little help, but still enough to leave plenty of room for the scholars to argue. So there's a hadith collected in Sahih Muslim, according to which Abu Sa'id al-Khudri said, I heard the Messenger of Allah, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, say, whoever of you sees something wrong should change it with his hand. If he cannot, then with his tongue. If he cannot, then with his heart. And that is the weakest form of belief. In this hadith, there's three means of commanding right and forbidding wrong, a term that is not used but is understood to be connected, appear here in the order, first you physically do something, you change it with your hand, you make it happen. Then you use the tongue, you say something to someone. And then, only if you are powerless in those ways, you do the heart work. You cultivate the appropriate sentiments, the appropriate objection, which maybe it could be argued isn't changing anything at all, but of course, not everything that matters happens outside the human heart. The Prophet came for the perfection of morals. It's being streamed. You don't even have to record. I feel like the last time I was up here, Tarek was about 5, and he came and hid under the podium with me. He won't fit anymore. He's the tallest person in the house. Things change. So how have Muslim scholars, mostly but not only the jurists, talked about this over the centuries? How have they thought about these verses and this hadith or similar versions that exist in the Shia compilations as well? Now, there's a professor at Princeton who's written a book on Muslim approaches to commanding right and forbidding wrong. That's actually the title of the book, which was published by Cambridge University Press. It is 724 pages long. I have never written a book that long, so it's a daunting topic. And as is almost always the case among Muslim thinkers across the globe and over the centuries, there is at least one exception for every generalization. But one thing is really clear. The jurists tend to reorder these three modes of forbidding wrong. For them, the tongue comes first. you speak, you persuade, you maybe reason with somebody. Maybe you speak to them sharply and actually command, and maybe they obey you. Maybe you cajole. Maybe you remind them of something that they should have known or did know and weren't paying attention to. Then, if they don't listen, you escalate maybe. Maybe you do something physically, you intervene. You break the lute, or you smash the bottle of alcohol, or you physically get in the way of an attack. For the jurists, it's these two modes that mostly receive the lion's share of attention. The hating the wrong in your heart receives less. But say something and do something are still extraordinarily vague. So the main things that the jurists are interested in take up pages and pages and pages and pages. Who is obliged to forbid wrong? Who is permitted to do it? To whom are they permitted? And in what ways? So it's really important to remember that 1,000 years ago, 1,200 years ago, as the jurists are arguing with each other, with their predecessors, about what this duty means and how it should be carried out, they're generally in agreement that some people are obliged, but they're also extremely cognizant that they live in a deeply hierarchical society. They're not interested in changing that for everybody to be equal. That wouldn't have even occurred to them. And so for them, it is a matter of some consequence to think about the power relations between the potential forbidder of wrong and the actual doer of wrong, right? Some people don't get to tell certain other people what to do. Or if they're going to, they have to be extremely careful about it. Now, before we get to something more about the modes of forbidding wrong, I'll note that one big disagreement that they had was whether only the state or also private individuals could engage in acts of physically forbidding wrong, right? Smashing instruments, confronting brigands. Do you need the permission of the ruler to set up your militia, right? Does the mayor have to approve your neighborhood watch? There was disagreement on this. Another was if private individuals, and here this applies to forbidding wrong with the tongue as well, even the people who held that only the state could authorize physical force or violence thought that there was a place for individuals to use the tongue to forbid wrong. But is it really just people, or is it really the scholars, right? Or maybe the scholars are obliged and ordinary people might be permitted under certain circumstances. Most of their attention focused on the scholars specifically. This was slightly navel-gazing reflection on this central duty. They also acknowledged that there might be conflicts of interest. How do we respect privacy? If we hear the tinkling of what might be a forbidden instrument, do we scale the walls to look and see if somebody is in fact violating the rules? Or do we respect privacy and let it be? As always, there can be conflicts between two different values, and people weighed those differently depending on the situations. What's most striking about the way that the jurists discussed the duty of commanding right and forbidding wrong is, to me, that they considered the risks of this situation. If you try to tell somebody something, or if you try to physically intervene to stop a wrong from happening, are you putting yourself in jeopardy? Are you putting somebody else in jeopardy? Are you risking the destruction of significant property, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean if there's some risk that you shouldn't intervene, This is a real quietist attitude that not all of the jurists took. But it does mean that not only are you allowed to take potential harm to yourself into account, you are actually required to under certain circumstances, right? Risking, a terrible beating in order to stop a minor infraction is not for them worth it, right? You don't uphold the principle of a thing at all costs. Now, sometimes jurists weigh these up differently. Sometimes people prioritize the forbidding of wrong over the retention of privacy. Sometimes people let a lot go in the name of social stability. And a lot of discussions of forbidding wrong focus on the duty of the scholar to chastise a ruler who maybe is acting inappropriately. And so this is something that comes up a lot, and people weigh that differently. To step more broadly for a moment, we might say that commanding right and forbidding wrong sort of overlaps both ends of a spectrum that involves nasiha at one end, right, sincere, personalized, individual, voluntary guidance, and hisba, right, the market supervision, the enforcement, right, in public places. Now, today, in places like Saudi Arabia and Iran and Afghanistan, we might reasonably talk about the hisba as the morality police, right? They're very concerned with things like hijab, right, and beards and certain kinds of other public conduct. But in earlier times, the institution was mostly associated with marketplaces. And while there were some concerns about inappropriate mixing or the consumption of illicit substances, it's maybe a useful reminder for us as we think about how medieval Muslim scholars allocated resources toward preventing certain kinds of wrongs and harms, that one of their central duties was to ensure that merchants were not cheating on their weights and measures, right? So corruption and greed and fairness were major concerns for them. I could go on a lot more about these particular arguments that the jurists had. I'm not going to do so. But I think the thing that I want to make clear is that even on this point where people are very much agreed on the centrality of commanding right and forbidding wrong, the Muslim tradition is capacious. Principled disagreement is a feature, not a bug. Ikhtilaf ummati rahma, right? The Prophet reportedly said, the disagreement among my community, among members of my community, is a mercy. So on to some brief reflections about what we might take away from some reflection on this idea of commanding right and forbidding wrong. The first thing is that most of us, and I very much include myself in this category, are probably doing less than we can to encourage what is right and try to stop what is wrong. Now, there are limits, of course, to what any person can do, and even limits to what people organized collectively can achieve, realistically, especially under conditions of substantial political repression and even in some places, brutal violence. It is also simply the case that because of the way news cycles work, we cannot personally address every situation that comes to our attention. There aren't enough hours in the century, let alone a day, to do that. But this is a central tension for all of us as Muslims, right? Ultimately, human beings are powerless to contest God's will in any possible way, but that does not excuse us from action, right? The Quran tells us that Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change themselves. But themselves is interesting. Anfusihim, it also means their souls. right? So maybe here we come back to that notion of hating a wrong in the heart and what that can do for us. We have just a few minutes before Taraweeh. So I think maybe I will let a scholar who wasn't known as a jurist, but a philosopher and a mystic, have the floor for a moment as we come to a close. Al-Ghazali, who died in 1111, wrote a massive multi-volume compendium on the revival of the religious sciences. And the model of change he offered worked in concentric circles. It started with the believer getting himself, and I use the male pronoun advisedly, himself, then his household, his neighborhood, his city, and so on in order. And this guidance is valuable in important ways. For one thing, getting our own house in order gives us moral standing to be more effective as we try to forbid wrong and command right in other situations. Although many jurists say, even if you're not living up to all of those expectations, you're still required to command right. That's a duty that you don't get a pass from just because you're not doing the other ones. It's also, of course, more straightforward to start where you are with yourself. But there are some ways we can maybe think with Ghazali in our present moment a little more broadly. My colleague Zahra Ayubi, whose parents and family have been members of this center for decades, has pointed out that this model that Al-Ghazali used was very much predicated on the notion that elite men were the people whose moral perfection and improvement he was most concerned with, right? And who he saw as the movers and shakers in society. That doesn't necessarily hold for us today. And Al-Ghazali's model is also not necessarily appropriate in a moment where everything is happening everywhere all at once. We are actually now sometimes more easily in a position to affect things happening half a world away than we might be an intractable problem next door. That doesn't mean, of course, that we don't have duties to our households and our neighbors, but it does mean that we're not automatically excused from waiting to establish all of the proper levels of justice locally before we work broadly, right? So I think what is maybe helpful for us is to think back with the jurists about this effectiveness criteria. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a social strategist. I don't know what the levers are necessarily to make change work. But I do know that there are some things that we can be doing in the face of major wrongs in the world today that are not risky to us. Things like writing to legislators, things like op-eds in papers, things like using our tongues and our pens and our keyboards and our phones to communicate broadly about some of the things that need to be changed. We are not putting ourselves at risk. The calculus of potential benefit to potential harm is in favor of these sorts of actions. So I leave you with this. We as an ummah, and we as individuals, and we as a community and a congregation are called. The jurists might quibble over the details, right? Which one is obliged to do what and how, but we collectively have to be part of changing the conditions of our souls, of ourselves, and of our qawm, of our people, of our ummah. May Allah help me and help you to do better. Ameen. Thank you.